The morning over Riverton unfolded with a stillness that made people pause at their doorstep before stepping into the cold. A pale sheet of mist clung to the fields, drifting lazily across the frozen ground like a breath that refused to disappear. The wooden funeral home sat tucked beneath a slope of aging pines, its exterior washed in the muted gold of a sun too tired to shine. Inside, the air held the familiar scent of polished cedar and winter coats warmed only by grief. Outside the doorway stood Cooper, a honey-colored golden retriever with gentle eyes that once made strangers smile, now clouded with a deep, unspoken unrest. He didn't shiver from the cold. His body trembled for another reason entirely. The townsfolk, bundled in thick jackets and wool scarves, moved in slow, respectful silence. Riverton was the sort of place where people fixed their neighbor's fence without being asked, where old pickup trucks shared the same parking lot every Sunday after church, where a man's word still meant something. And Daniel Hayes had been one of those men. Steady, dependable, a lineman who climbed poles in storms most people hid from. His death during last week's blizzard had struck the community like a sudden darkness. People whispered that he'd been the kind who never backed down from helping, even when it meant risking himself. Especially then. Cooper's paws pressed into the frosted ground as his gaze locked on the white coffin inside. His breathing hitched in small, uneven bursts, as if each inhale carried a warning he didn't know how to voice. A few mourners nodded at him with tenderness. Older folks who had seen enough of life to know dogs grieved just as heavily as humans. But none of them noticed how focused Cooper's stare truly was. How sharp, how present, how fiercely alive. "Come on, boy," murmured Lynn Hayes, her voice as thin as tissue paper. She bent slightly, brushing a hand over Cooper's head, her fingers trembling. Losing a son had carved grief into the corners of her eyes, and today she moved as though gravity had tightened its grip on her. "It's the last time you'll see him." But Cooper didn't step forward. He backed away slowly, deliberately, ears folding down for a moment before springing upright again. Anxiety rippled through his body in tiny waves. Lynn exhaled shakily, assuming the dog was simply heartbroken. Her daughter, Sarah, lingered by the entrance, brushing her dark bangs from her eyes as she watched Cooper with a strange heaviness settling in her chest. She had always believed animals sensed more than humans ever could, something her grandfather once said while teaching her to bottle feed orphaned calves. A creature's instinct is God's first language. Inside, the funeral director adjusted a microphone that hummed softly through the quiet hall. A local musician plucked the first melancholic notes of an acoustic guitar, its warm tone drifting like smoke into the rafters. People bowed their heads. Hats were pressed to chests, gloves removed, fingertips exposed to the cold air out of respect. The hush was reverent, almost sacred. Yet Cooper remained at the doorway, refusing to cross the threshold. His eyes never left the coffin. Sarah approached him slowly, kneeling until her breath fogged the air between them. "Cooper," she whispered, "you can come in. Daniel would want you here." Her voice cracked despite her effort to sound steady, and she reached to scratch the familiar spot behind his ear. But Cooper didn't lean into her touch. He stiffened. His tail, once soft with sorrow, now hovered in a tense line behind him. His nostrils flared, catching something. Some trace, some whisper, something Sarah could not possibly perceive. A tiny frown creased her brow. She glanced toward the coffin, then back at Cooper, unsettled by the tension vibrating through him like a plucked wire. Beyond the windows, the valley wind stirred gently, rustling brittle branches. A single pine cone tumbled down the steps, tapping lightly against the porch. It was the kind of morning where even small sounds echoed too loudly. As the guitar inside shifted into a deeper, mournful chord, Cooper finally took one step forward. Not toward Sarah, not toward Lynn, but toward the coffin. His whole body angling with a sense of purpose that made Sarah's breath hitch. For the first time since sunrise, she felt a prick of something unwelcome and impossible pressing against her ribs, a quiet, cold suspicion that the day might not unfold the way anyone expected. A suspicion that Cooper was not grieving. He was warning. The wooden door creaked as more neighbors entered, brushing snow from their jackets, murmuring condolences to the Hayes family. Riverton was small enough that everyone knew everyone, and the loss of Daniel Hayes had settled over the town like a heavy winter fog. The air inside the funeral home was warm, almost overly so. But Cooper remained rooted to the threshold, as if the line between inside and out were a boundary he could not cross. His body leaned forward, yet his paws stayed planted, claws lightly scraping the wood. The subtle sound drew Sarah's attention again, tugging her away from the whispered prayers drifting through the hall. "Come here, buddy." Tom Brenner, a firefighter who had worked many calls with Daniel, crouched down and patted his thigh. Tom was the kind of man people trusted instantly. Steady shoulders, warm eyes, and a voice trained to stay calm in chaos. "It's all right. He was your guy." The invitation was gentle, the voice familiar. But Cooper didn't respond. He stared past Tom as though the world behind the man had shifted. Lynn stepped closer, her gloved hands twisting together. "He's scared," she murmured, though her tone carried more hope than certainty. "He doesn't understand what happened." Her voice trembled at the edges, the grief pressing so hard that even simple words became fragile. But Sarah watched differently. The way Cooper's head tilted, the way his nose twitched, not with sadness, but with attention. The way his ears flicked, not backward in fear, but forward in alertness. It unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She placed a steady hand on her mother's arm. "Mama, something's off. Look at him. He's not acting like he did when Grandpa passed, remember? She stopped herself, unsure how to explain the sensation tightening her chest. Grief muddled logic, but instinct. Instinct was instinct. Her mother sighed, eyes glossy. "Sweetheart, we're all a little off today." From deeper inside, the guitarist shifted to a softer hymn, the kind sung at old country funerals, simple chords that felt like the hum of a porch light glowing through decades of family memories. The melody floated toward the entrance, wrapping everyone in a blanket of sorrow. Still, Cooper would not move. The dog lifted his chin, his breath forming a small cloud in the warm air. Something in that exhale made Tom straighten. He studied Cooper a moment with a firefighter's intuition, the same sense that told him which burning beams were ready to fall, or when a survivor still had a chance. "You feelin' something, boy?" he murmured. Cooper answered, not with a bark, but with a faint, restless whine that trembled through his chest. Before anyone could speak again, Mrs. Clayton, the Hayes family's elderly neighbor, approached slowly, leaning on her cane. She smiled weakly at Cooper, her silver hair gleaming beneath the light. "Animals know things we don't," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of too many winters. "When my husband had his heart trouble, our old Labrador paced the house all night before it happened. I never forgot that." Sarah looked at the older woman with a flicker of affirmation. "So you think—" "I think," Mrs. Clayton whispered, "you listen to a creature when it refuses to walk the same road as you." Cooper took a single step forward then. One, only one, and stopped again. His eyes fixed on the white coffin at the front of the room, unblinking. It was as though a line of invisible tension stretched from his chest straight to that still, closed shape. He breathed once, twice, slower, deeper, then released a soft rumble barely audible under the hymn. Sarah felt her skin prickle. "Something's wrong," she whispered, almost involuntarily. Her mother squeezed her arm. "Honey, grief is playing tricks on you." But Sarah shook her head. "No, not grief, Cooper." Tom frowned, glancing from Sarah to the dog. "You think he's sensing—" "What? His scent?" He hesitated, not wanting to say the word death out loud. "Sometimes animals react strongly to the body." "It's not that," Sarah interrupted quickly. "He's not scared of the coffin. He's drawn to it." Lynn's breath caught, a sound as brittle as a snapping twig. Beyond them, the guitarist paused between chords, and for a heartbeat, the room was utterly still. Cooper lifted his paw as if preparing to step forward, then froze, muscles rippling beneath golden fur. His tail stiffened, not tucked in fear, but raised in focused agitation. Then he glanced back at Sarah, and for a split second, the look held something chillingly clear. Resolve. Not grief, not confusion. Something closer to insistence, almost urgency. A gust of Wyoming wind slammed against the side of the building, rattling a window pane. Lynn jumped. The sound broke the strange spell for everyone except Cooper, who didn't flinch. He was listening, not to the living, to something deeper. Sarah swallowed hard, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. "Mom," she whispered, "I don't think Cooper is refusing to go inside." She touched her mother's arm as Cooper finally lowered his head, eyes locked on the coffin. "I think he's refusing to say goodbye." The guitar's gentle chords drifted through the cedar hall like warm smoke, settling into the quiet hearts of friends and neighbors who had come to honor Daniel Hayes. Folding chairs creaked softly as people shifted, pulling tissues from coat pockets, wiping the cold from their cheeks. The funeral home felt small today, too small for the weight it carried. At the front, the white coffin stood beneath a wreath of winter evergreens, their needles dusted with frost brought in from the storm outside. A framed portrait of Daniel rested nearby, his smile frozen in time. Bright, unknowing of the grief now gathering under the roof he'd never walk into again. Cooper finally stepped inside. The moment his paws touched the polished wood floor, something in the room shifted, subtle but unmistakable, like the quiet warning before a Wyoming windstorm breaks. He didn't linger near the doorway or pause beside the aisle like most dogs would. Instead, he moved forward with a determined, almost haunted precision. His collar jingled lightly, a delicate sound that somehow felt louder than it should have. People turned their heads. Some smiled sadly. Others whispered how loyal dogs always understood when someone they loved was gone. But Cooper wasn't mourning. Not yet. He walked straight toward the coffin. Sarah rose halfway from her seat, heart knocking into her ribs. "Mama," she whispered, though she wasn't sure what she meant to say. Lynn dabbed her eyes with the corner of a white handkerchief, unaware of the electricity threading itself through her daughter's voice. Then it happened. A bark. Sharp, clipped, slicing through the melody like a blade. It wasn't a long howl or a cry of sorrow. It was one clean, urgent sound, one that vibrated in the wooden floor, in the chairs, in the marrow of every person sitting inside that dimly lit hall. The guitarist's fingers froze on the strings. Several people gasped softly. A man in the second row muttered, "Poor thing, he's grieving hard." His wife nodded, squeezing his arm. But Sarah didn't sit. She remained standing, breath caught in her throat. "Tom," she called quietly to the firefighter sitting 3 chairs away. "Do you see that? His body language. It's not—" Tom frowned, watching Cooper closely. "He's on alert," he murmured. "Not upset. Focused." Cooper's muscles trembled beneath his honey-colored coat. Not with fear, but with intensity. His head lowered. His tail stiffened. He released a low, guttural sound that sent a ripple of unease through the room. Then he barked again, louder this time. Not at the mourners, not at the door, not at shadows or imagined shapes. At the coffin. Lynn covered her mouth. Tears gathered anew. But these were different. Confused, alarmed, edged with something she didn't dare name. "He's just overwhelmed," she whispered, though her voice rose as if begging someone, anyone, to confirm it. But no one could. A hush swept through the hall, colder than anything outside. Mrs. Clayton clutched her cane. "Animals sense what we miss," she murmured. "Something stirring that dog." Cooper approached the coffin directly now, until his nose nearly touched the gleaming white surface. His breath fogged it with tiny clouds of warmth, fading quickly into the chill of the room. He barked once more, deep, forceful, as if commanding everyone to listen. Sarah felt a tremor run down her spine. Her fingers curled tightly around the wooden pew. What if... She swallowed hard. What if he's trying to tell us something? Tom shook his head slowly, uncertainty weighing on him. He stood, moving cautiously toward Cooper. Easy, boy. What do you hear? Cooper didn't look at him, didn't move, didn't blink. He stood guard before the coffin like a soldier refusing to abandon his post. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, and for a moment, it sounded almost like a voice too faint to understand. Inside, no one dared breathe. And Cooper, unmoving, unwavering, watched the coffin with an intensity that made the entire room feel suddenly, terrifyingly alive. Which moment shocked you the most so far? 1, 2, or 3? Comment your answer below. The room had barely recovered from Cooper's startling bark when he stepped even closer, his movements slow and deliberate, as if drawn by something no one else could sense. The soft strum of the guitar had faded completely now. Even the musician's hands hovered mid-air, suspended in uncertainty. The hush that followed wasn't the gentle quiet of a respectful gathering. It was dense, unnatural, a silence that pressed against the ribs. Snow-heavy wind hissed against the walls like a distant warning. Inside, every gaze had fixed on Cooper. He reached the coffin. The gesture he made next was so unexpected, so oddly human, that several people gasped aloud. Cooper lowered himself slightly, angled his head, and pressed his ear directly to the smooth white lid. His breathing slowed. His entire body went still, frozen, listening, absorbing. Sarah clutched the wooden pew so tightly her knuckles whitened. "Mom," she whispered, though Lynn's face was already drained of color. Tom's brows knotted, his firefighter instincts kicking in with an intensity sharpened by years of listening for signs beneath rubble and wreckage. The dog wasn't grieving. The dog was detecting. For a few suspended seconds, Cooper didn't blink. His chest barely rose. He was a statue carved from gold and fear. Then his eyes widened. Just a fraction, but enough to ignite tension across the room. He lifted his head and released a sound that cracked straight through the funeral home, a soft, trembling whine that carried urgency and heartbreak all at once. It wasn't the wail of mourning. It was a plea. "What on earth?" one man murmured, stepping back, his winter boots scraping the wooden floor. A retired rancher at the back of the room, Mr. Halpern, leaned heavily on his cane and muttered, "Animals hear the quiet things, things buried deeper than we dare imagine." No one responded. Not because they disagreed, but because a strange feeling crept into the hall, curling through the air like mist seeping under a door. A feeling that something about this day, this ceremony, this moment, wasn't what they all believed. Lynn's hand trembled violently as she clutched her necklace. He's confused," she whispered, but even she didn't sound convinced. Her gaze flicked to the coffin and away again, as though afraid to stare too long. Tom stepped forward, palms raised. "Let me check on him," he murmured, though he wasn't sure whether he meant the dog or Daniel. Cooper ignored him completely. The dog turned his head slightly, nose gliding along the edge of the coffin, inhaling small, sharp breaths. His tail rose, stiffening with a confidence that electrified the room. Then, in a motion devoid of hesitation, he nudged the coffin with his snout. First gently, then firmer, a clear, deliberate insistence. The wooden lid shifted the faintest bit beneath the pressure, though no one wanted to acknowledge it. Sarah's breath hitched. "He's trying to get our attention," she whispered. Lynn shook her head, stepping back as if the coffin itself frightened her. "Sarah, stop, please. You're letting your heart make up stories." But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. She had fixed her eyes on Cooper, who now rested a paw lightly, almost tenderly, against the side of the coffin, as though urging someone, to respond. A low vibration traveled through the floorboards, nearly imperceptible, just enough to raise the fine hairs along Tom's forearms. He turned sharply toward the coffin, his heart lurching. "Did anyone else feel?" Before he could finish, Cooper's ears snapped upward. The room thickened again. Even the air felt weighted, waiting. Cooper pressed his ear to the coffin a second time. No one breathed. And then he stiffened, eyes going wide, pupils darkening like storm clouds rolling in. He knew something. He absolutely knew something. And whatever it was, it terrified him. He pulled back, trembling, and let out the softest whimper. The kind a dog gives when it hears the impossible. A whimper that crawled up every spine in the room and settled like ice beneath the skin. Sarah felt tears gather without knowing why. "Talk to us, buddy," she whispered. "What are you hearing?" Cooper didn't answer. Of course. But his gaze, fixed again on the coffin, told them more than words ever could. Something inside that box had changed. Something alive had whispered back. For several long seconds, no one moved. Cooper stood before the coffin like a sentinel carved from breath and trembling muscle. The funeral home felt smaller by the moment, the cedar-paneled walls seeming to lean inward, as if they too were trying to hear what the dog had sensed. A thin line of winter light slipped through the narrow windows, casting pale stripes across the floorboards that flickered each time the wind shifted outside. Those beams fell directly over Cooper now, gilding the fur along his spine, highlighting the tension rippling beneath his golden coat. Sarah approached slowly, her boots whispering against the wood. She wasn't even sure why she was moving, only that something inside her refused to stay still. She knelt beside Cooper, letting her hand hover inches above his back. She didn't touch him. It felt wrong to interrupt the concentration etched into his posture. "Buddy," she murmured, voice barely more than breath. "What are you trying to tell us?" As if answering, Cooper's body vibrated with a soft, anxious whine. He lifted his paw and placed it again against the coffin, gentle but insistent, the way a child might tap a shoulder to get someone's attention. Tom watched intently, arms crossed, his chest rising and falling with deliberate breaths. Animals don't behave like that unless they sense something real, he said, more to himself than anyone else. His voice carried the weight of years spent rescuing people from collapsed barns, flipped trucks, and power outages that turned deadly in Wyoming winters. He knew what instinct looked like. But Lynn stepped forward quickly, shaken. "Please, don't do this," she whispered. "My son is gone. The doctor said—" Her words collapsed beneath the emotion clawing up her throat. Sarah rose halfway, torn between comforting her mother and the magnet-like pull drawing her attention back to Cooper. That was when Cooper's head lifted. Not with panic, not with confusion, with recognition. His ears pricked sharply, and for the briefest second, he tilted his head, as though tracking a faint, impossible rhythm, invisible to everyone else. Before Sarah could ask what he'd heard, something brushed against her palm. She gasped. Her fingers had settled lightly, almost unconsciously, against the edge of the coffin. And beneath the cool white lacquer, beneath the thick wooden lid, she felt something. Subtle. Feathery. Like a tremor from a creature stirring in sleep. It lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was real enough to send her heart lurching violently. She pressed her hand more firmly, eyes widening. "Mama," she whispered, unable to force her voice any louder. "Mama, I felt something." Silence evaporated into quiet murmurs. People exchanged looks, some incredulous, some fearful, some suddenly hopeful in a way that frightened them. Hope, after all, could be cruel when misplaced. "That's grief talking," Lynn replied, though she sounded like she was pleading with herself. "No," Sarah insisted, her voice trembling yet certain. "It wasn't in my head." Something moved. Mrs. Clayton, leaning heavily on her cane, looked at Sarah with the solemnity of someone who had buried too many loved ones. "Child," she said softly, "grief can play tricks, but so can God." Cooper nudged the coffin again, his nose pressing hard enough to shift his breath into short, frustrated puffs. His tail shot out straight, trembling with intensity. His eyes, normally soft, gentle, were now locked with unwavering purpose. Tom stepped closer and placed his hand where Sarah's had been. His rough palm lingered, waiting for anything, any pulse, vibration, whisper of life. Nothing. At least, nothing he could identify. He exhaled heavily. "I don't know," he muttered. Sarah rounded toward him, irritation and dread twisting her features. "You felt something, didn't you?" Tom hesitated. A long, drawn-out moment where his eyes flicked from Sarah to Cooper to the coffin, then back to Sarah. "I'm not sure what I felt," he admitted, "but I felt something." A fresh wave of tension washed across the room. People shifted uneasily in their chairs. The wind rattled the windows again, and someone whispered a prayer under their breath. Cooper stared at the coffin, his body taut, his breathing shallow, his entire being silently screaming the truth his voice could never form. Then, as if needing to confirm the impossible, Sarah pressed her hand one more time to the cold, white surface, And this time the tremor came again. Clearer, stronger, unmistakable. She jerked her hand back, clutching it to her chest. "Mama, something's in there." Lynn staggered backward, shaking her head as though trying to deny the world itself. "No, no, don't say that." But the truth was no longer avoidable. Cooper hadn't been grieving. He had been listening. And now, so was everyone else. The funeral home, once filled with soft hymns and quiet condolences, had shifted into a fragile tension. One thin enough to snap, yet heavy enough to press on every chest. The air no longer felt warm from the heaters humming along the walls. Instead, it sat cold and restless, stirred by something deeper than winter wind. Riverton's townsfolk, accustomed to the certainty of life and death in a rugged Wyoming valley, found themselves gripping their coats a little tighter, glancing around as if seeking reassurance from faces equally unsettled. Cooper stood planted near the coffin, his stance no longer just attentive. It was adamant, determined. His fur bristled along his shoulders, and every muscle was coiled like an arrow drawn back, but not yet released. He didn't bark this time. That almost made it worse. The silence he held felt purposeful, as if even he knew the next sound might change the room forever. Tom was the first to break through the hush. He stepped forward, boots creaking on the floorboards, and laid his hand once more on the coffin. "I swear I felt something earlier," he said. Voice low, steady, but tinged with disbelief. Not movement exactly, but resistance, like there was pressure on the other side. Someone gasped softly. Another person whispered, "Lord, have mercy," beneath their breath. Sarah stood close to Cooper, one hand hovering near his collar, not to restrain him, but to steady herself. Her heartbeat hammered against her ribs, a rhythm too fast, too loud. "Whatever you felt," she murmured, "it wasn't the wood expanding. This building's heated. It wasn't temperature." She swallowed hard. "It was something else." Lynn shook her head vigorously, tears streaking down her cheeks. "No, no, Daniel is gone. The coroner said, he said my boy, he said there was nothing more that could be done." Her voice cracked into splinters. "Don't give me hope where there isn't any." Hope. The word hung in the air, dangerous as a match near dry grass. Mrs. Clayton moved her cane forward, step by careful step, until she reached the coffin. Her voice, thin but steady, broke the wall of silence. "I've lived long enough to know that experts don't know everything. Sometimes the body fights longer than anyone thinks." She looked up at Lynn, her weathered eyes soft. "Sometimes God ties a knot at the end of our rope so we don't fall completely." Lynn pressed her lips together, overwhelmed. Cooper shifted suddenly, not violently, just a single step sideways, ears twitching toward the side of the coffin, head angled as though detecting a faint echo beneath the surface. He leaned in and sniffed, drawing in a deep breath that made Sarah's throat tighten. Her mind flashed back to when Daniel once joked, "If anything ever happens to me, that dog'll know before anyone else does." At the time, she'd laughed. Now, it didn't feel like a joke. Tom straightened, running a hand over his jaw. The firefighter in him, trained to read danger, to interpret silence, to decode the smallest shift in the environment, was no longer dismissing the possibility forming in the corners of his mind. "Look," he said slowly, "I'm not saying he's alive." The room leaned toward him. "But I'm not saying he isn't." A ripple of unease spread instantly. A woman in the back clutched her husband's sleeve. A man nearer the front crossed himself. The guitarist set his instrument down gently, as though afraid a wrong vibration might disturb something sacred. Sarah's voice trembled, but did not break. "Mom, please, just let Tom check. Let someone check." Lynn's hands shook as she held the handkerchief to her lips. She stared at the coffin for a long, excruciating moment, her grief warring violently with a possibility she was terrified to believe in. "If he isn't alive," she whispered, "this will break me all over again." Sarah stepped closer, her voice soft but resolute. "If he is alive, and we don't act, we'll lose him twice." The truth of that line cut through the room with surgical precision. Tom nodded once as though reaching a decision deep in his bones. "I'll go get a stethoscope from my truck," he said. "Riverton fire crew always carries one for emergencies." But Cooper moved first. He placed his paw firmly against the coffin again. This time higher, closer to where Daniel's chest would be. His nails clicked lightly, echoing like distant punctuation marks. His eyes sharpened with unmistakable urgency. No one spoke. Not a single breath disturbed the tension. Sarah leaned closer, nearly whispering into the quiet. "What do you hear, boy?" Cooper answered by staring so intensely at the coffin that for the first time, everyone in the room leaned in with him, listening, hoping, fearing the truth that might come next. The tension inside the funeral home thickened into something almost physical, as though the air itself were bracing for whatever came next. Cooper stood frozen beside the coffin, eyes locked forward, muscles taut beneath his golden coat. The faint hum of the heater, the rustle of winter jackets, even the quiet breaths of the mourners, all of it blurred into a muted backdrop, eclipsed by the dog's unshakable focus. It felt as if the entire town of Riverton were holding its breath inside that cedar-scented room. Tom returned from his truck just as a gust of Wyoming wind rattled the window panes again, the sound echoing like distant thunder. He carried a stethoscope in one gloved hand, though he hesitated before using it, unsure whether he was prepared to confront the impossible. As he approached the coffin, Cooper shifted, only slightly, but enough to draw every eye toward him. "Easy, boy," Tom murmured, crouching. "Let me listen." Before the metal of the stethoscope could touch the coffin, Cooper suddenly straightened, ears lifting sharply as if someone had called his name. His tail rose, quivering at the tip, and his gaze sharpened to a razor point. Then, thump. A soft, hollow knock, so subtle it could have been imagination, rippled through the wood. Gasps erupted across the room. A woman near the back dropped her prayer card, and the sound felt loud enough to crack stone. Sarah's heart seized inside her chest. She grabbed the pew for balance as her vision blurred with shock. "Mom," she choked out. "Mom, please tell me you heard that." Lynn's lips parted, but no sound escaped. Her eyes locked onto the coffin, as if she were afraid it might move again. Afraid it might not. Her entire body trembled, collapsing inward like a structure hit at its weakest beam. Tom stumbled back a step, stethoscope clattering softly against his jacket. I don't," he started, but couldn't finish. Even words felt too fragile for what had just happened. Cooper barked. Not a frantic sound, not grief-fueled noise, but a single sharp command. His paws dug into the wood floor. His chest puffed with air that vibrated through him like a warning bell. Sarah's legs carried her forward before she could think. She knelt beside Cooper, hand hovering near his neck, for comfort. Though she knew he didn't need reassurance. She did. "That wasn't the building," she whispered, voice trembling. "It wasn't the wind. It wasn't anything else." A few people shook their heads, frightened by the implication. Others pressed closer, drawn by the gravitational pull of something they never expected to witness in their lifetime. Mrs. Clayton spoke first, her old voice quivering but certain. "That was inside. That sound came from inside." Lynn crumpled onto the nearest seat, face hidden in her hands. No, Daniel was gone. He was gone. They told me." Tom knelt beside her, words gentle but uncertain. "Ma'am, whatever's happening, we're hearing it too." Before anyone else could respond, it happened again. Thump, louder, clearer, undeniable. Every muscle in the room locked. A man whispered a hoarse prayer. Someone else began to cry softly. The funeral director backed against the wall, stunned into silence. Tom rose slowly, turning to the crowd. His voice came out barely above a whisper. "If there is even the slightest chance that Daniel is alive in there, we need to act." Cooper growled softly, not in threat, but insistence, as if urging them to move faster. Sarah placed a trembling hand on the coffin surface. "Hang on, Daniel," she whispered. "If you're in there, just hang on." The room braced once more, caught between, terror and hope so fierce it bordered on pain. Then the impossible echoed again, filling every soul with the same certainty that had lived in Cooper from the start. The knock wasn't a fluke. It wasn't imagination. It wasn't a trick of grief. Someone inside that coffin was trying to come back. Which reaction felt the most powerful to you? 1. Sarah. 2. Tom. Or 3. Cooper? Comment your answer below. The first knock had shattered the calm, but the second knock destroyed every last thread of doubt. It came like a pulse beneath the wood, deep enough to tremble the air around the coffin, sharp enough to slice through the tension binding the room. The sound didn't echo like something falling or shifting. It struck with intent, with direction, with life. Cooper lunged forward, not aggressively, but urgently, his paws scraping against the polished floor as a bark burst from him, raw and commanding. His whole body surged with certainty, every hair on his spine bristling in fierce alignment. The older folks in Riverton, people who had lived long enough to stop believing in coincidences, stared in stunned silence. "Sweet Jesus," someone whispered. Sarah's breath caught so sharply she almost doubled over. She grabbed the coffin with both hands, as if hoping her grip alone might confirm what her heart had already accepted. Her forehead touched the cool lacquer, while her pulse hammered against her ribs like fists on a door. "Daniel," she whispered. Not to the room, not to the mourners, but to the wood beneath her palms. A soft rattle vibrated back. Not a knock, not a thump. Something closer to a breath searching for escape. Lynn's knees buckled. Tom, moving quicker than anyone expected, caught her before she hit the ground. "Easy, ma'am," he murmured, though his own hands shook as he helped her to a seat. But Lynn shook her head violently, grief and disbelief warring across her expression. "No, this can't be happening. My son was declared dead. Dead." Her voice cracked so sharply it felt like glass breaking. Yet hope, quiet, dangerous hope, was already blossoming in the room. Tom turned toward the coffin again, his voice low but strong. "Listen, everyone. Listen carefully." Cooper growled, low and trembling, then fell silent. The room froze. You could have heard the snow melt on the roof, then thump. It wasn't timid this time. It was the knock of a man fighting to return to the world. Sarah gasped, hands flying to her mouth. Mrs. Clayton began to cry softly. A young man in the back crossed himself. People who had spent their whole lives knowing exactly where the boundary between life and death lay, felt that certainty crumble beneath their feet. "Tom," Sarah whispered. "You hear that? You hear that, right?" Tom nodded, throat tight. "I do." He pressed his ear against the coffin. A quiet moment passed. Another moment. His eyes flew open. "He's alive." The words were barely more than breath, but they struck the room like thunder. Lynn sobbed harshly, burying her face in trembling hands. "But how? They said he was gone. He was gone." Cooper barked again, loud, urgent, as if shouting for them to move, to act, to save. Tom stepped back, adrenaline rising. "We don't have time to figure out the how. We need to open this coffin. Now." Fear rippled across the mourners. What if it's unsafe? What if he's barely holding on? What if... Sarah cut through their voices, her own trembling but resolute. "What if we lose him because we hesitated?" Silence. Her words pierced every beating heart in the room. Tom placed both hands on the coffin lid. "All right, folks, on my count." But he didn't finish, because the next sound wasn't a knock. It was a scratching, slow, weak, desperate, the unmistakable scraping of nails or fingers against the wood from inside. Cooper whined, pressing his body against the coffin as if willing Daniel to hold on longer. Tom's face hardened with determination. "We're opening it. Get ready." The crowd backed away, breath shallow, eyes wide, souls suspended between horror and miracle. Cooper planted himself beside Tom, unmoving, unblinking, bracing for what came next. The line between life and death had never felt so thin. And in that fragile, electrified stillness, one truth echoed through the room. Daniel Hayes was fighting to return, and his dog had been the only one who heard him. For a moment, no one dared move. The scratching inside the coffin, a frail, wavering sound, hung in the air like a thread stretched to breaking. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. It carried intention. It carried fear. It carried life. The mourners, who moments ago had entered the funeral home certain of death's finality, now stood on trembling legs, their minds fighting to comprehend what their senses could no longer deny. Tom's jaw tightened. The grim resolve of a man who had spent half his life pulling survivors from the jaws of tragedy. He placed his hand firmly on the coffin lid, grounding himself. "Everyone step back," he said, voice steady but edged with urgency. "We're opening this, now." No one argued. No one even breathed. The stillness was almost unnatural, broken only by Cooper's soft growl, a deep, protective vibration rising from his chest as he pressed himself against the coffin's side. His golden fur bristled along his spine, not in fear, but in conviction. He knew, he had always known. Sarah moved to Tom's side, her hands shaking, yet her expression steady. The fragile hope blooming in her eyes was painful to witness. Hope born from loss always carried an ache sharper than grief. "Let me help," she whispered. Tom nodded. "On 3. But Lynn stumbled forward before he could begin counting, her face ghost white, grief and shock clashing violently in her trembling voice. "Wait. What if he's suffering?" The words tore from her, raw and terrified. What if opening it? What if we hurt him? Tom rested a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Ma'am, if he is alive, and those sounds say he is, then opening this coffin may be the only thing that keeps him here." Cooper barked once, sharp and decisive, as though supporting Tom's statement. The sound jolted Lynn, pushing her tears over the edge. She pressed a trembling hand to her heart. "Daniel, my boy." "We'll do this gently," Tom promised. "We'll do it right." Several men from the crowd stepped forward. Neighbors who had worked with Daniel on storm repairs. Men who had thrown hay bales with him, shared beers with him after long winter shifts. They stood shoulder to shoulder now, unified by the unthinkable possibility that life still lingered inside the coffin. "Ready?" Tom asked, voice low. As they gripped the edges of the lid, Cooper suddenly lunged, planting both front paws on the side of the coffin, his body tense and unwavering, his eyes locked with Tom's, fierce, urgent. "Easy, boy," Tom murmured. "We're doing this for him." But Cooper didn't relax. He held his position, bracing himself, ready to shield Daniel the moment the lid opened. "1," Tom breathed. The room shrank into silence. "2." Sarah closed her eyes, pressing her fingertips to her trembling lips. 3. They lifted. The lid shifted with a faint creak, the hinges sighing open after days of stillness. A cold breath of air escaped from the coffin, carrying the sterile scent of embalming materials and something else, something undeniably human. The crowd leaned forward, eyes wide, searching for movement, for a sign, for anything. Then they saw it. Daniel's chest, barely visible beneath the crisp ivory shirt, rose, just a fraction, just enough to shatter every wall of certainty inside the room. Sarah gasped, so sharply her knees buckled. Lynn let out a sob that cracked the air like lightning. Cooper whined, pushing closer, his nose brushing Daniel's sleeve, as though afraid the moment might dissolve if he didn't touch it. Tom leaned in, his breath unsteady. "Daniel, can you hear me?" There was no answer at first. Then, from deep within the stillness, Daniel Hayes drew a shallow, trembling breath, thin as the Wyoming winter wind, but real, alive. The funeral home erupted, not in chaos, but in stunned, reverent shock. A miracle had unfolded where none had been sought. A line had been crossed, between despair and salvation, between what was believed and what was now undeniable. Cooper pressed his head against Daniel's arm, anchoring him to the world. And Daniel, weak, broken, but fighting, stirred beneath the touch, a small, almost imperceptible response that sent a new wave of astonishment through the room. Tom swallowed hard, emotion thickening his voice. "We're getting him out. Now." The impossible was no longer impossible. It was happening. Right here. Right now. And the dog had known first. The room, moments before suffocating in disbelief, now vibrated with a fragile electricity. Alive, trembling, and perilously thin. Daniel Hayes, who had been mourned, prayed over, and declared lost to the winter storm, lay before them with the faint rise of breath fluttering beneath his shirt. It wasn't strong, it wasn't steady, but it was there, like a distant ember refusing to die out. Tom's hands shook as he leaned closer, his voice cracking despite years of keeping calm under pressure. "Daniel, if you can hear me, stay with us. We've got you." His words hovered in the cold air, tender but filled with urgency. The men beside him steadied the coffin, fear and awe knotting tightly in their throats. Cooper pressed his muzzle into Daniel's arm, trembling with relief so fierce it bordered on pain. His soft whine carried a depth of devotion no human tongue could replicate. Sarah knelt beside the dog, barely daring to breathe as she touched her brother's hand. It was cool, too cool, but not lifeless. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice breaking, "please keep breathing. Please." Lynn stood frozen, a hand over her heart, as if holding herself together by sheer force. Tears streamed silently down her face, not the wrenching sobs of earlier, but something gentler, stunned. Tears born of a miracle she had never asked for, but desperately needed. My boy, she whispered. My sweet boy. Outside, wind battered the building, shaking flakes of snow loose from the eaves. Inside, the impossible unfolded with slow, aching clarity. Daniel's eyelids twitched. Not enough to open, not enough to wake, but enough to send a shockwave through every soul in the room. Tom moved into action. Help me lift him out, he said, gathering his strength. We need him flat. We need him warm. And we need to get in Tron. Ambulance here now. Hypothermia can mimic death. If that's what happened, every second counts. Two men stepped forward. We've got him, one said. The other cleared his throat, voice shaking. Just say when. Now, Tom commanded. They lifted Daniel carefully, like cradling the wings of a wounded bird. His body was stiff, cold, lighter than any living man should be. Cooper backed up only enough to avoid being in the way, but he kept himself close, refusing to break the invisible tether between them. Sarah scrambled for blankets, whatever she could find in the storage closet. The funeral director, pale and speechless, handed her a wool throw usually draped over family chairs. She wrapped it around Daniel's torso, her fingers shaking violently as she tried to tuck warmth into a body deprived of it for too long. Tom leaned close to Daniel's mouth, listening. Breaths are shallow, slow. He tapped Daniel's cheek lightly. Stay with us, buddy. Your dog wouldn't let you go. Don't you dare give up on him. Cooper pressed his forehead into Daniel's elbow, a tender gesture, desperate and protective. His breathing quickened, matching Sarah's. Daniel's lips parted. A thin stream of air escaped, a sound so faint it nearly disappeared under the wind rattling the windows. But everyone heard it. Everyone. Mrs. Clayton clasped her hands to her chest. A murmured prayer rolled softly from her lips, trembling like a flame in a storm. Lord, give him strength. Tom straightened. Call 911. Tell them we have a hypothermic survivor, low pulse, possible shallow coma. The word survivor struck the room like a bell, pure, resonant, unbelievable. A young man fumbled with his phone. Dispatch says weather may delay them, he said, voice cracking. Ambulance might take 20 minutes. Tom cursed under his breath, a rare break in his composure. 20 minutes is too long. We need to get him warm now. Towels, coats, anything. Bring them. Riverton didn't hesitate. Coats came off shoulders. Scarves unwound from necks. Old ranch hands and teenagers alike slipped jackets beneath Daniel's body, creating warmth with whatever they had. And Cooper climbed gently onto the pile of coats, curling against Daniel's chest, offering the heat of a living heartbeat. Sarah's eyes filled. Keep him warm, boy, she whispered. You already saved his life once. Daniel's fingers twitched. Barely, but enough to turn disbelief into roaring hope. Tom exhaled shakily. We can still lose him, he warned, though emotion strangled his voice. But he's fighting. He's really fighting. Cooper responded with a soft, determined bark, as if promising Daniel wasn't fighting alone. The moment Daniel's faint breath shimmered into the cold air, The entire funeral home shifted, from disbelief to a frantic, organized desperation. Gone was the stillness of mourning, replaced by the sharp rhythm of urgency, as if every heartbeat in the room synchronized into one collective vow. Save him. The Wyoming wind roared outside, rattling the eaves, while inside the townsfolk scrambled with sudden purpose, their boots thudding across the wooden floor. Tom took charge instantly. Years of emergency response had wired his instincts to move faster than fear could catch up. "We don't wait 20 minutes, he barked, his voice cracking through the chaos. "We move him ourselves." His hands were steady, but his jaw shook with adrenaline. Hypothermia was a cruel trickster, making the living appear gone, then threatening to steal them again if warmth didn't return quickly enough. Sarah held Daniel's cold hand against her cheek. "You hear that, big brother?" she whispered. "We're taking you home, not letting you out of our sight again." Her breath trembled, mixing with his faint exhale. She tried not to look at his lips, pale and barely parted, afraid that if she stared too long, she might lose the fragile proof of life she'd just witnessed. Cooper stood guard, his entire body pressed against Daniel's zadam. His warmth seeped into the man beneath him, a living furnace refusing to let the cold reclaim what it had nearly taken. He nudged Daniel's arm, whined softly, and licked his hand, actions that seemed to stir tiny reflexes, subtle twitching, a whisper of survival fighting through layers of frost. "We need blankets," Tom said, grabbing 2 from a supply closet. "And someone bring that heavy canvas coat from the truck. It'll trap heat." Men sprinted out into the storm without hesitation. Snow blew in through the door before it was slammed shut again. Lynn knelt beside her son, her trembling hands cupping his cheek. For years, she had comforted him through childhood fevers, heartbreaks, and broken bones from football practices. But nothing prepared her for this moment. Touching skin that felt caught between 2 worlds. "Stay with me, Danny," she whispered. "Please, don't go anywhere." Her voice, raw with motherly pain, pulled more tears from the already shaken crowd. When the men returned with coats and thermal blankets, they wrapped Daniel like a newborn, layer upon layer of warmth cocooning him. Tom motioned for space. "All right, we lift on 3, slow and steady." They counted. They lifted. Daniel's limp body rose from the nest of coats and arms. Sarah guided his head while Lynn steadied his shoulders. Cooper walked beside them, position unwavering, his steps in perfect rhythm, as though he understood the sacred fragility of the moment. The door burst open, wind slapping their faces with ice. The world outside was a blur of white, snow swirling so thick it erased the horizon. The funeral home sat at the edge of town, a 10-minute drive from Riverton General Hospital. Under normal conditions, it would be nothing. But the storm had turned the roads into unpredictable paths of frost and drifting powder. Tom led the way toward his truck, a rugged old Ford with chains on the tires. "Put him in the back seat," he ordered. "Someone keep pressure on his pulse point. Someone else monitor his breathing." "I've got his pulse," Sarah said immediately. "I'll watch his breaths," a neighbor volunteered. "And Cooper rides with him," Tom added. "He's done more for this man than any of us." Cooper jumped into the truck before anyone else could move, curling beside Daniel's legs, his nose pressed firmly against the man's ribs, listening, guarding, praying in the only way a dog could. As they settled Daniel into the seat, his fingers twitched again, slightly, stronger this time. Lynn let out a sob that melted into the wind. "He's fighting. My boy is fighting." Tom climbed behind the wheel, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Hold on, Daniel," he murmured. "We're giving you everything we've got." The engine roared to life, tires crunching over ice as they pulled away from the funeral home, a place meant to say goodbye, now transformed into the starting line of a miracle. Inside the truck, the heating vents blasted warm air. Sarah counted breaths. Cooper kept vigil, and Lynn whispered prayers against her son's forehead. No one knew what awaited them at the hospital, but they knew one truth with absolute certainty. Daniel Hayes wasn't leaving this world without a fight, and he wasn't fighting alone. The truck skidded into the emergency bay of Riverton General Hospital, its tires fighting through slush and ice as if the storm itself were trying to hold Daniel back. Tom slammed the vehicle into park, and before the engine fully stilled, he shouted for help. The automatic doors parted with a mechanical hiss, spilling fluorescent light into the snowy darkness. That harsh glow, cold, sterile, relentless, made Daniel's pallor appear even more haunting. Yet beneath that ghostly stillness was the unmistakable rhythm of a man refusing to let go. Nurses rushed out with a stretcher, their scrubs flapping in the wind. "Hypothermic victim, shallow respirations, possible cardiac compromise," Tom yelled over the gusts. "He needs immediate warming protocol." "Let's move," a nurse barked, her professionalism slicing through the chaos. Sarah held Daniel's hand as they transferred him, whispering his name as though breath alone might anchor him. Lynn nearly collapsed from the intensity of the moment. Her son, who hours earlier had been pronounced dead, was now being wheeled through bright hallways, fighting for the future she thought had been stolen. Cooper ran alongside the stretcher, his nails tapping frantically against polished linoleum. No one stopped him. No one even tried. In that moment, the hospital understood. This dog was part of the emergency response. Inside the trauma bay, monitors flickered to life. Electrodes were attached, blankets piled high. A bear hugger warming unit roared to life, hot air flowing beneath insulated sheets. A doctor leaned in, his brow furrowed with disbelief. "You're sure he was declared deceased?" Tom nodded. "Wind chill dropped 20 below during the storm. We found him unresponsive in a snowbank. Pulse was absent. But his dog wouldn't give up." The doctor exchanged a glance with a nurse, one of those silent, heavy exchanges that acknowledged both medical impossibility and the reality unfolding before them. "Hypothermia can mimic death," the doctor murmured, almost to himself. "Slow the heart, slow the breath. We've seen it before, but never this far." Cooper whined as they inserted an IV line. His body trembled, not from fear, but from urgency, devotion. something ancient and unbreakable. Sarah placed a hand on his back. He's doing everything he can, boy. Let them help him now. Daniel's breath fluttered again. Weak, fleeting, like a match flickering at the mercy of the wind. The monitors beeped irregularly. Every sound tightened the room. Every hesitation scraped nerves raw. But slowly, rhythm crept into the chaos. One beep stabilized, another synced. His chest rose, still faint, but unmistakably alive. The doctor exhaled sharply, relief softening the tension in his face. He's fighting. Keep warming. Keep monitoring. Lynn stepped forward, her voice trembling like paper in a draft. Is he going to make it? The doctor didn't offer false comfort. We'll do everything in our power. Right now, that includes warming his core, stabilizing his vitals, and watching for neurological response. He held Lynn's gaze gently. Your son is a miracle already. The rest will take minute by minute. Sarah squeezed her mother's hand. Mama, he's not alone. Not anymore. Outside the trauma bay, a small crowd of hospital staff had gathered, whispering in awe. Stories of impossible survival tended to travel fast, especially in towns like Riverton, where community and faith often walked hand in hand. Some murmured prayers. Others stared at Cooper with newfound reverence, as though he weren't just a dog, but a guardian appointed for this very moment. The storm raged against the windows, but inside, warmth, both literal and human, surrounded Daniel. Cooper lay down beside the stretcher, eyes fixed on Daniel's face, refusing to blink, as if the force of his gaze alone could tether his human to life. Minutes stretched. Machines beeped. Air warmed. And then Daniel's hand twitched, just slightly, but enough to draw gasps from both nurses. Sarah clutched her chest, tears streaking down her cheeks. Do it again, Danny. Please. Show us you're still in there. As if hearing her, Daniel's fingers curled slowly, weakly around Cooper's fur, and for the first time since this nightmare began, hope didn't feel terrifying. It felt real. Which moment hit you the hardest? 1, 2, or 3? Comment your choice below. If you want the story to continue, say, write chapter 13. The night over Riverton felt endless. A long corridor of fear illuminated only by the blinking lights of the ICU monitors. Snow continued to drift past the hospital windows, each flake catching the glow of the parking lot lamps, like tiny sparks refusing to die. Inside Daniel's room, however, time did not move in weather or wind. It moved in breaths. Fragile, irregular, precious breaths that everyone counted as if their own lives depended on them. Lynn sat closest to the bed, her hands wrapped around Daniel's, warming fingers that had been too close to the cold for far too long. Her thumb brushed across the back of his knuckles, slow, deliberate strokes carrying 32 years of motherhood in every pass. She whispered prayers in a cracked voice, prayers trembling between pleading and gratitude. Come back to us, Danny. Just come back. Sarah stood near the foot of the bed, arms wrapped around herself, as if trying to contain emotions too large for her small frame. She watched Daniel's chest rise beneath the heated blankets. Each shallow lift a victory. The memory of his hand twitching earlier replayed in her mind like a lifeline she refused to let go of. "He's in there, Mom," she murmured, voice thick. "I know he is." Cooper lay on the floor beside the bed, his head resting directly beneath Daniel's dangling fingers. His breathing matched Daniel's rhythm. Slow, cautious, loyal, as if syncing his heartbeat to the man he had fought so fiercely to protect. Every time Daniel exhaled, Cooper's ears twitched. Every time Daniel inhaled, his tail barely shifted, a quiet celebration of life lingering where death had nearly claimed victory. The room remained silent until the door creaked open and the doctor stepped in. His face, lit by dim overhead lights, carried the fatigue of a man who had seen more endings than beginnings. Yet tonight, something gentler softened his stern expression. "We've run another neurological check," he said, pulling off his gloves. "And things look promising." Lynn straightened, hope flaring across her face like sunrise. "Promising how?" she asked, terrified of the answer. "Well," the doctor continued carefully, "we're seeing reflex activity returning. The warming therapy is stabilizing his core temperature. His heart rhythm is strengthening." He paused, letting the words settle. "Your son is holding on, and that alone is extraordinary." A soft gasp escaped Sarah's lips. She turned to Cooper, unable to stop herself from reaching down to stroke his fur. "You did this," she whispered. "You never gave up on him." The doctor chuckled lightly under his breath. "That dog may end up in medical textbooks. Instinct like that. That's something we can't teach." As they spoke, a subtle change drifted through the room. Not a sound, not a shift in light. Something quieter, something felt more than seen. The tension that had gripped the air began to loosen, replaced by a fragile calm, as though the room itself dared to hope again. Then Daniel's fingers moved, not the twitch from before, a real, intentional movement. Slow, weak, but deliberate. His index finger curled, first inward, then outward, as if trying to trace the familiar warmth of Cooper's fur. Sarah's breath broke into a sob. "Mom, look!" Lynn bent forward, covering her mouth with a shaking hand as tears streamed freely down her cheeks. "Danny, baby, I'm right here. We're right here." Cooper lifted his head and nudged Daniel's hand gently, whining in a tone that couldn't be anything but relief. The doctor stepped closer, voice hushed with reverence. "He's responding to external stimulus. This is very, very good. Time 1000 mon." He glanced at the monitors, then back at the small family gathered around the bed. "Let's give him time. His body has fought the impossible. Now it's time for his mind to catch up." Sarah leaned close to Daniel's ear. "Don't rush. Just come back. Follow Cooper. He'll guide you." Outside the window, the storm began to ease. The wind softened, The snow settled, and somewhere between night and morning, a faint warmth crept into the sky. The first hint of dawn touching the world again. And inside the hospital room, where death had once seemed certain, the same dawn returned, through the smallest movement of a man who refused to leave his family behind. Morning broke slowly over Wyoming, filtering through the hospital blinds in thin, muted ribbons of gold. The storm had finally quieted, leaving behind a hush that felt almost sacred. Inside Daniel's ICU room, the world moved gently. Machines hummed, warm air drifted from vents, and Cooper lay curled beneath the bed like a silent guardian carved from devotion itself. Every now and then his ears twitched, responding to sounds only he seemed able to interpret. Sarah sat beside the bed, her hand wrapped around Daniel's. Hours had passed since the first signs of neurological response, and though hope had returned to the room, fear still lingered beneath every breath. She whispered softly, as if afraid her voice might startle fate into changing its mind. "Danny, you can take your time. Just don't stop fighting." Lynn dozed in a chair nearby, exhaustion finally softening the edges of her grief. Her fingers clutched the hem of a blanket draped over her lap, white and worn from years of washing, familiar like the lullabies she used to hum when her son was small. Even in sleep, her face twitched with worry. But for the first time in days, peace touched her expression. Tom entered quietly, holding 2 steaming cups of weak hospital coffee. "Morning," he whispered, handing one to Sarah. "How's he doing?" Sarah shook her head softly. "Still the same, but better than before. I think he hears us." Tom nodded, his eyes drifting to his friend. The man he had once climbed icy poles with, shared long shifts and longer nights with. Seeing Daniel suspended between life and death had carved something sharp inside him. Now, watching him breathe, watching his fingers respond to Cooper, it felt like witnessing a miracle he would never forget. Then it happened. A tiny shift, barely more than a whisper of movement beneath the blankets. But it was enough. Daniel's eyelids fluttered, weak at first, then firmer, as though muscles long frozen were thawing back into purpose. Sarah gasped, leaning forward, her coffee forgotten. "Mom! Mama! Wake up!" Lynn jerked upright, eyes wide, hair disheveled from restless sleep. What's happening? Look!" They watched, breath suspended, as Daniel's lids lifted again. Not fully. Just enough to reveal a sliver of dull blue beneath. His gaze drifted, unfocused, the world blurry and too bright, but undeniably real. Cooper shot up instantly, paws scrambling on the floor as he nudged the bed, tail sweeping in hurried, hopeful arcs. "Daniel," Lynn whispered, tears instantly filling her eyes. "Baby, it's Mom. I'm right here." Daniel blinked once. Slow. Heavy, then again. Sarah pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. He's trying to wake up." Tom stepped closer, his voice tight with emotion. "Danny, buddy, can you hear us?" Daniel's throat tightened, working through dryness and weakness so profound that even the smallest sound felt monumental. His lips parted, but no words came, just a faint exhale, as though trying to speak from a place far beneath the ice he'd endured. Cooper, overwhelmed by instinct, placed his front paws gently on the edge of the bed and pressed his head near Daniel's cheek. That familiar scent, warm fur, safety, home, seemed to tether Daniel back to the present. His eyes shifted, focusing as much as they could. A single tear slid from the corner of his eye. Lynn broke. She collapsed over his hand, sobbing into his knuckles. "Thank you, God. Thank you for giving him back." Daniel's fingers twitched weakly in hers. Sarah let out a cry, half laughter, half heartbreak, and kissed her brother's forehead. "You came back," she whispered. "I knew you would. Cooper knew you would." Tom wiped his eyes discreetly, clearing his throat. "Well, damn," he muttered softly. "Didn't think I'd live to see something like this." Daniel blinked one more time, lifting his gaze toward the warm blur pressed beside him. He opened his mouth, managed a faint breath, and forced out a hoarse whisper barely louder than air. "Cooper." The dog whimpered, tail beating the bed frame in frantic celebration. It was enough. Daniel was awake, and the world in that small hospital room, once filled with grief, rose like dawn breaking over the valley, quiet, breathtaking, and full of impossible light.